Okay, so this is a story of the beginning of Linux, the beginning of open source, and it all relates back to AI. Richard Stallman was the creator of the GNU project, which is a project where they basically recreated one program at a time and built an entire operating system completely with volunteers where every program was open source, which means you could read the code, you could change the code, you could do whatever you want with the program. Uh, and it's interesting because Richard Stallman actually worked at the AI lab at MIT. And he could foresee that there was this profit motive and this corporate drive and this handshake between, academia, the business world, the military, that was just going to leave people behind if technology accelerated beyond our understanding and without allowing anyone to be able to open it up and see how it works. So he could see that this was going to go bad a long time ago. When was this? Like the 80s or something? Maybe, yeah, I think it was the 80s. So he left MIT and he created the GNU project, created Linux, created an actual legal framework to defend open source software. And he made the GPL license, which is an open source license, which has been defended in court, which is just saying that basically you can't use the source code that's under a GPL license unless you release the source code of the program you make with it. And if you modify the source code, you still have to release the source code if you started with that code. But there's been this process of Richard Stallman and the GNU project improving the license. So now they're on, I think, GPL 3 or more. And GPL 3 is so cool because, well, GPL, I don't know which version, it might have even started with the first version, but GPL is a viral open source license, which means if one thing uses open source and uses the GPL license and your program wants to incorporate that code into it, you have to make that program now also under a GPL license. And this created this interesting rift where the corporate world couldn't really use the open source stuff if it was under GPL license because it was protected from ever being bought and sold. Uh, I should say it is technically possible to buy and sell open source software. It's just a lot harder because anyone with technical know-how can grab the code, compile the program, and now they don't need to pay you for the program. And they can also then do some slight modification or something and then just resell it. So the GPL is like a scientific license in a way. It's all about peer review and everyone helping each other build the world we live in instead of just some corporation like Microsoft releasing something that we just have to use and assume that there's no bugs, and then it is full of bugs, and then no one can fix the bugs because no one knows what they are because you're not allowed to look at the code. So open source over time really proved itself to be much more robust software, but also software that was somewhat difficult to buy and sell. One of the versions of the GPL, they had to improve the fact that corporations found a way around this with TiVo was like the big one that did this first, where they actually used Linux, but then they just made the box it was in like impossible to open and just made it so you couldn't like get to the Linux even though it was running on Linux. And so it became very difficult for people to crack open the system and see how it works or do anything with it. And this is a time when, I think this is like, I don't know if the Xbox 360 was out, but this is like around the time of that kind of era where like, and people were using their video game systems as computers sometimes, like the PS2. I think someone got Linux on there. but TiVo had Linux on it, so this frustrated open source people to no end, which is why one of these GPL versions is specifically about, okay, you have to make it open source, you also have to make it accessible, and if there's some reason I can't get to it, you have to make it like publicly accessible, the code on your website or something. So Richard Stallman, with his eyes on the prize of defeating Skynet, he worked in the AI lab to begin with, and he's had his eyes all the way to this moment that we're in now. And he's been trying to defend us from this catastrophe that we're sort of starting to get into here with AI. The path that Linux has taken is really interesting because although it started as just like the people's operating system, it actually has become, because of how well it worked, how robust it was, and the fact that it used basically like a scientific model, which is, like a peer-reviewed model where everyone in the world can work to improve on the same code. This created this situation where the open source movement really took off and Linux became super strong and powerful, and it actually became basically the number one thing that all servers are running on. Almost, I think it's over 90% of the internet, the servers are just running on Linux. So what's interesting about that is as Linux became so robust, so powerful, so ubiquitous, even though it's kind of behind the scenes, because on the surface level, if you weren't super into programming and stuff, you still kind of ended up falling for Microsoft or Apple because you didn't want to learn how to do anything. Meanwhile, Linux became more user-friendly, but Microsoft and Apple keep doing all these tricks like getting contracts with the military, contracts with universities, getting like many-year contracts where they'll give low-priced laptops, low-priced software to all these students, get them all basically dependent on this software ecosystem without really realizing the price tag they're getting involved in, because it's been superficially lowered by the fact that the price they pay is lower, but also by the fact a lot of them have financial aid or are still dependent on their parents, so they haven't fully felt what the world is like yet. They're just still, this is like the time when credit card companies are funneling out free credit cards to you and just, come on, just get them in debt before they realize anything about the world. Suckers are born every day, get them. Basically getting people sort of used to their programs and ecosystem, and then just sort of, once you're used to it, you think there's nothing else you can use and you just don't feel like switching, and you don't realize how much money you're spending on it, and you don't realize that there's an open source alternative, because these same corporations are kind of controlling the narrative online, especially these days. So what happened from there is really interesting because actually Android is based on Linux. And the reason this could happen is because there was basically a disagreement between Richard Stallman and Linus Torvalds. Linus Torvalds is the person who the Linux operating system is named after, even though he only wrote the kernel. Well, I shouldn't say only. I think he also made the program Git and stuff. He definitely has done a lot, but they have a disagreement on the licensing. So Richard Stallman thinks, yeah, we need to have this be the most open source possible license, because he's thinking, this technology will one day be like robots walking around. I don't know exactly what he was thinking, but he knows AI is going to be a big deal. And he knows that if it can totally take over the world if we don't make it open source, and that basically the progress of technology itself has to be a democratic process. Otherwise, we're all doomed. And he's 100% right about that, and he knew this in the 80s. Then Linus Torvalds wanted Linux to be more, I guess he wanted it to be more agreeable to the wider world. And he didn't have this like utopian vision from out of this universe like Richard Stallman. And I totally buy into that vision as well. But Linus Torvalds is more of a corporate guy, or at least just believes that the business world is somehow important or something. I'm not really sure. But so after all this effort of building this awesome operating system, the kernel is this one part of the operating system that kind of bootstraps. That's just the term, like pick yourself up by your bootstraps. It's kind of a weird term, but that's what it's called in the computer system. Bootstrapping is like, it is a good term for that because, like MLK says, how can someone pick themselves up by the bootstraps if they don't even have any bootstraps? And like, I agree with that. But then in this case, it's like picking itself up. It is kind of, you just hit the on button and then the power goes in, and the first thing it hits is the kernel, and that basically has to like blossom the whole rest of the processes starting up at a very, very low level of hardware. And so the kernel is very difficult to program. And to this day, the GNU project has still not managed to make the kernel open source and work right, because Linus Torvalds over there, he made the perfect kernel and it works right, and so that's what Linux runs on. And it's just that one little seed that starts all of the programs starting up, that starts the operating system. That's the one part he made. And then the entire point of the project was that GPL, a viral open source operating system that would like spread free and open source everything everywhere. But he didn't use the GPL3 license. He just kept using the GPL2 license and made the decision to not move to the GPL3 license because of its provisions about preventing DRM and preventing TiVoization. So then the kernel was created in a way that you are allowed to use it without everything being free if it uses it. So that allowed Google to use that kernel in their Android operating system. And even though they basically had to rewrite all the software, they sort of had that basic component to get it going. It goes to show just how hard that kernel was to write, the fact that Google needed to use it for their operating system. They did modify it slightly, but if it was under the GPL license, even a modified version of it would have meant that that whole operating system had to be free and open source. And that's free as in freedom, not free as in beer. Although I think free as in beer is also free as in freedom, but that is a whole other video. So it's a weird story because it also made Linux become more popular to consumers, whereas most people now have Linux on their phone, a lot of people, but they don't even know it really. It's not really, it is kind of Linux if it has the same kernel, but it's not really Linux because it doesn't have the GNU project programs, which is most of the operating system. But it also means that a lot of people have like an operating system on their phone that basically can run Linux on it, even as an app or something. I don't know. There's something to that there. I think of them as like, I like to think that the universe just had this plan perfectly laid out, where like, because Richard Stallman is always so perfectly on point with his message, as long as he's talking about open source and Linux specifically, then that is like this driving force for open source that is undying and has like the end goal in mind, even the AI problems that we're running into now. Whereas Linus Torvalds kind of allowed Linux to blossom in his own way by allowing it to become a consumer operating system that people use even if they don't even really realize they're using it. So now you can say, well, if you're using Android, you're using Linux, and the whole internet servers run on Linux. So at this point, it's like a very thin illusion of why we are really buying things that are like all this expensive software and expensive operating systems, when the entire infrastructure of the internet is built on free and open source software. And now even consumer electronics are often built on free and open source software. Although they do the thing, the TiVoization, as it's called, that makes it so you can't really get into the operating system and access it. Because if Linus Torvalds had put GPL3 for his kernel, then they wouldn't have been able to do that. But you could also argue then it never would have been on Google's phone, and Linux would have just never touched a consumer electronics that's just like a normal consumer electronics for people who don't program and stuff. Okay, so flash forward many years, and now we're in the AI era, or at least we're about to be. Well, no, we already are, because Facebook is using AI, and that had like a huge effect on depression and, the global and countries' narratives. All narratives of humanity where the internet is touching have basically been affected by all these AI run algorithms in various ways that we can never perfectly pinpoint what happened, but it's definitely part of why the world feels crazy and weird now. And now AI is just starting to become like available to consumers as something you can actually talk to, because AI was already working for doing a lot of things, but they hadn't quite gotten it talking yet. They could make an AI robot find its way through a room using light and stuff. But these large language models that can actually read and write and stuff, they are a step towards basically actual artificial intelligence. So now people are talking more and more about AGI, which is general artificial intelligence. And that is when the brain of the AI is basically as smart or smarter than a human. What's interesting is all those years ago, Richard Stallman created this whole concept of open source and created the first open source license. And now AI is being released under open source licenses. So that entire story arc worked out. And we aren't necessarily, if we fight for our rights and stuff, we aren't necessarily doomed, because technology, because of this infrastructure that has been built by people before us, they have made it possible for technology to be a democratic process. Like there's a bunch of independent AI hobbyists like working with that website Hugging Face that just has like a ton of free models, and it almost looks like a research website where people are just posting their results, posting their data sets for other people to use. And so it's interesting because there's all this discussion, especially in YouTube videos and news articles and stuff, about these major CEO, major companies, major AI companies, and like whether they're ethical and all this stuff, and they're like definitely becoming embedded with the government. Meanwhile, the entire open source world has always been there, and AI is advancing so fast in the open source world that it's like only a half step behind. If you think about it, as technology improves, the open source technology is catching up, because as technology speeds up how fast it's getting better, then and if you're only one step behind all the time as open source, then you're like, when the world makes a leaps and bounds like this in AI, open source makes those leaps and bounds with it and just is one step behind right there. So it's like, I mean, even some of the large open source models right now might be actually the best ones out. So, but before this gets too long, I just wanted to tell you this cool history of open source and Linux and the expansion of open source to the point of actually getting into the industry it was meant for. At the time, it's important. And even companies like Microsoft, which is the arch nemesis of Linux back in the day, is releasing things under open source licenses inspired by the Linux project. So I think it's clear what way things could be going if we don't let these corporate psychos decide everything for us. And they're just holding on thinly to this illusion that they still run our technology, when I'll make a different video about this, but AI is actually getting so efficient it can run on such small devices that they're going to just completely lose their monopoly, and no one will have to rely on any corporations anymore pretty soon for any of their AI needs. But we'll see. But that's my take on it. All right, thanks. I'm going to make another video about small models and how they're democratizing this whole process, and maybe in that one, yeah. Thanks for listening.